So yeah, I will talk about the power of visual representation. So thank you so much again for having me and for attending this talk. The visual representation that I mean here is like the concept broadly construed. So by visual representation, I mean any depiction of information that is based on visuals rather than a linear sequential verbalization or text, right? So this includes, just to give a few examples, graphical elements in a user interface, such as buttons and icons. These are visual representations of commands, or a scrolling bar, which is a visual representation of the notion of a viewport within a document. Or if you think about a progress bar, which is also a visual representation of the concept of system progress doing a task. So all of those are visual representation of particular concepts. But there are also like many more. So drawing, sketches, they are also visual representations of information when they capture concepts and ideas. Here's an example of a sketch note book that captures the main and key ideas of a talk. You might have seen some examples of that. And visual representations can also be photorealistic or even real life representation of information, right? So here we have an example of the famous model of the alpha helix from Linus Pauling. And of course, visual representations of actual data or data visualization, such as statistical charts or data views that we can generate in a visual analytics system. So for the talk today, I thought I would go over why choosing appropriate visual representations in user interfaces is such an important design decision to guide and empower people, and also to show that this is far from being a trivial task. Many people think it's easy to come up with a nice and clean and effective visual representation of concepts. It's not, it's hard. And so oftentimes also visualizations are thought of as just an output modality. So you're being presented with something and then you consume that from the display, but it's also important to consider visual representations as input. So I will demonstrate a little bit of that. But let's start with at the beginning. What are visual representations great for? So the first argument that you will often hear is that visual representations of information are powerful because they allow to externalize cognition. Because you pull information from your head and put it in the world, you basically free up cognitive resources. You don't need to access this brain, neurons, it's just all displayed for you outside of your brain. And you can use out of your, very powerful perceptual system to acquire the necessary information as you are at the task and use the brain to think and make connections and so on. So let's see an example. Many of you are probably familiar with this example. It's been shown several times. It's a simple visual representation that shows the number of murders committed using firearms in Florida for the past 30 years or so. And so in 2005, the state of Florida enacted what is called the Stand Your Ground law, which basically makes it legal for you to, use force to defend, yourself if you feel threatened. So you use force, which could be like, lethal force, right? And so what happened after the law was enacted, as we see in this visualization, what does this chart show us at a glance? What we would see, sorry, I'm trying to find my up. What we would see, I don't think you see my actual mouse cursor. Never mind. So what do we see after this annotation in the visualization? We see a clear drop in the chart, which is great, right? So the state seems to be safer than it used to be, which is good news. And perhaps our reasoning would be that the very fact that it's legal to shoot someone for self-defense seems to have successfully discouraged criminal acts and resulted in less deadly consequences. But wait a minute, is that really the story? in this chart? Does anybody want to challenge that story? Did you pay attention to the axis in the chart? The axis goes downwards here. It's a true visualization that has been published by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. So the y-axis is going downwards, which means what we perceive as being a drop is actually an increase. And if we turn the graph around and put it back in the chronological order, we have the exact opposite story than the one I just told you. Of course, if you make it legal to shoot people, well, more people get shot. That's pretty much a no-brainer. But the fact that the chart was designed otherwise suggests a different story, and quite actually the opposite story. So this is what I mean really here when I talk about the power of visual representation, right? So the chart that we saw prior doesn't technically lie because all of the information was there, but it is clearly a malicious design aimed to mislead the audience. Why? Because you're used to read these type of charts with a y-axis going upwards, right? And as you see the previous chart, you made a quick snap judgment, reading a chart that you expect with respect to conventions and standards, and believe that there was a drop because it's what, the chart perceptually, suggests to us. And this reliance on your previous experience makes it that you are less acute at detecting the subtleties in the design. So, of course, many of you would say, like, I would never design such a chart. It's terrible. I agree. It's terrible. Sure. But do you think that as a viewer, you would not fall into such trap ever? I don't know if you did, as I showed you the first version of the chart. I certainly did the first time I saw this chart because I'm so used to read this visualization and have so strong expectations that it would follow the standards that I didn't take the time, didn't put effort in rereading the axis. We just get the first perceptual signal there. So it is likely that many of us would overconfidently rely on our visual judgment and interpretation in these cases. So that brings me to a first takeaway that I would like to share with you guys. I will have a few ones that I cover in this presentation. First one, decoding visual representations of data is deceptively simple. Here I showed an example that is pretty obvious with a clear violation of an established standard, but it's so big and obvious that it actually isn't. We fall easily in the trap. And there are plenty of other more subtle cases that can be at play, which we know from studies in cognitive science and visualization. So there are many expectations and assumptions that one inherently has when they approach a visual representation of information and a context. So you may have beliefs and be subject to confirmatory bias, for example, or you may be in a particular mindset or situation that makes you more or less acute to interpret the representation for what it is. So it's really easy to miss out on something. So here's another example. These two charts show the same data about access to safe drinking water in two different fictional cities. So can you see what changed? So it's the same data, two different representation. And which one is better? I can see you guys actually in the video stream. So who believes that the left chart is better to show the data by show of hands? Who believes the right chart is better? Who believe both? I'd say none and both, actually, because it actually depends. So I understand your reasoning. So if you were raising your hand for whichever right case scenario, it's because you say oh, we have truncated the axis in the other one, so we may misrepresent the data in the left chart because the truncated axis kind of overemphasize the difference between those two bars. which is right. But at the same time, if you show only the right version of the chart, then you don't have a good appreciation of how much it's difficult to perceive how much of a difference. So it really depends on the task. If you are trying to emphasize the difference and allow an accurate reading of the difference and can compromise on accurate estimate of magnitude, then the left representation is good. But it's often considered as being deceptive because it results in an exaggeration of the difference between the two quantities. There's way too many pixels compared to the absolute value to have our brain reason correctly about this. But if you are trying to show the magnitude, then the right chart is better, but that makes perception of the difference much more challenging, right? So by using one or the other, you make one of the two tasks more or less difficult. In the former, one can say it's not truthful to the data as you hide the magnitude. And in the other case, you can be reproached to hide the difference. So the second takeaway here, is the design of visual representations involves making trade-off decisions, almost always. So each design will result in making it better for some tasks, but worse for many other tasks. So is that inevitable? Well, yes, if you consider that a single design choice is possible, but here in this particular example, why not presenting the viewer with both views? I've been making the argument that both are useful, so why not presenting both? So this is what we studied with my collaborators at U of T. Basically, we thought, why not adding simple interaction like a click or hover over so that the viewer can easily transition between the close-up deceptive views, right, where the y-axis is truncated, and the full view that best represent magnitude on an absolute scale, right? And depending on the task, you can, as a viewer, as a user, just pause on the view that's better for you for the task at hand. So we call this technique the perceptual glimpses. It's very simple in principle, but that's not all. So we have access to those two views, but you don't quite fully get away by not having to choose between two reasonable options. There's still one more decision as a designer that we had to do to design these perceptual glimpses. The question is, which one of the two views should you present first? It may have an impact, and it does. So is it better to show the global view first to give a sense of magnitude and then zoom into the details? Or is it better to show the details first and then contextualize this data by transitioning to the non-truncated view to appreciate the magnitude, right? And so informed by cognitive psychology science, we thought that showing the non-truncated view first, this one, the overview first, would help mitigate the exaggeration of the difference that truncated views typically cause in viewer. So if I prime you or if I anchor you in the overview and then show you the details, we believed, based on prior literature on similar topics, that it would be better. But one very interesting finding from our studies is that the overview first mantra that we often use in visualization resulted in participants finding themselves deceived by the non-truncated view. So it's pretty surprising of a result. People with a view that people think is deceiving, they were like, with a view that we think is non-deceiving, this one that you see right now, people thought they were deceived because when you zoom in, they saw, oh, that was much a bigger difference than you kind of suggested to me, which was counterintuitive to us in terms of findings. So it's interesting here. So beside this, particular finding that was surprising, where I'm going here is that you can't really avoid, as a designer, having to make these decisions, which one to go first, which one to go left, which one to go right, and so on and so forth. So the thing is, design of visual representations involves to make all and every decision about location and visual aspect. Because representing something visually requires you to put it somewhere in the space, right? And to give it a shape and color and all of that, right? And the very moment you make such a decision of laying things out in a particular fashion, or shaping things up in a particular fashion, or using colors in a particular fashion, for every such decision, be sure that you create new opportunities of conveying information that you did not intend to, and effect a reading that you did not intend to. It's very complex. There are many, many subtleties. And so because it's likely that someone may see a meaning where there is not, or they may be influenced also by one of the perceptual or cognitive biases that we just saw examples of a moment ago. But let me pause here. I don't want to, for you to think that what I'm telling is that no matter what you do, you never win. The visualization is all a lost battle. There's always going to be caveats, always going to be suboptimal or worse, wrong, or we can mislead. Yes, but the truth is that it's not so terrible. Visual representations are super powerful and do help truly in most cases. So I'm just communicating with these few examples how easy it is to underuse their power, or even worse, reverse or misuse their powers against your initial intent. And that's very important to be aware of such caveats. So let's see success stories now. Think about a physician who sees many patients within a day. Of course, physicians don't try to remember all of the facts about a patient out of memory, but instead they rely on patient records, right? Often in the form of textual notes to recollect what the patient's clinical history is or assess what the patient's problems are. And patient records are quite often very voluminous. That is, here in this example, it's only 15% of a single patient record with 300 notes, a number which is not uncommon for patients with chronic illness. And so even though the information is out there as text, you can easily imagine it's quite difficult to go over all of it and integrate what of the information it contains. It's difficult. You need to read through all of these pages. Yet it's critical for the physician to get as complete and as accurate a grasp of the patient's clinical trajectory as possible to provide appropriate care, right? So they have a lot of information, but it's very difficult to consume. And that's where visual representations can greatly help, right? So here we have an example of a data visualization, which is powered by computational methods, such as natural language processing. So you go and feed these notes, and you extract meaningful patterns, important key terms, temporality in the data, and so on. So this example is Docurate. It's a visual analytics tool to support a quick patient review through interactive visual exploration of the clinical notes. It's been developed in my lab by my former PhD student, Nicole Siltanem, who now works at Tableau Research. So the tool is interactive and is designed such as on the left of the tool, you have a visual representation of the frequency of the symptoms or medications of interest within the patient record. So we have here cardiovascular, symptoms, and we see that, the timeline going, through time, and oh, here there was an episode of these symptoms. Here there was another episode of these symptoms, and you have that for a number of different, categories of symptoms, right? So these frequencies are showed over time. The oldest record is at the top, and the most recent record is at the bottom. And you find elements that go beyond data charts also in this interactive dashboard. In the middle here, we have a scroll bar there, which is in fact a visual representation of the collection of notes that is used for spatialization. So where I am in this collection of notes, so I see I'm at the beginning of the collection. I see the current viewport, and then it's just traditional timeline. But what you can do is, like, when you start interacting with this tool, you get to see, like, interesting, relevant information. So if your particular focus of interest here is on the endocrinology, then you have all of the views that update accordingly. highlights in the notes, highlights in the collection here. So the scroll bar is augmented, and then like relevant information. So all of the views are synchronized to help you navigate this information space. And all of these together, they make for a powerful interface for exploration of data that the clinicians can extract from these documents. So you can filter things, you can query things, you can do a bunch of things. The purpose is not to give you a detailed account of how to use this particular tool. The idea is like, through interaction, you can specify the system, what is your analytical intent, and then we have visualization that are tailored to support these particular tasks. So we evaluated this with actual clinicians, and we found that more patient problems more quickly and more accurately were found than using the textual notes only. So yes, visual representations of information, when tailored to tasks, they do help. And related to our earlier discussion, perhaps some of you are already telling yourself, well, perhaps we could improve this visualization on the left. Why? Because that's actually strange. I don't know for you, but at least for me it is. It is strange to represent time from top to bottom. We usually have timelines going from left to right, right? So that's one of the standards that we see, that the timeline go from left to right. Most oldest content on the left, and as we go through time, it passes like from left to right. So that's true. A horizontal timeline would perhaps be more natural because of standards and conventions. But there we are. The visual representation is part of a larger graphical ecosystem here. So we have notes on the right because it's important to the physician to have access to this data. And these are presented in the most traditional document view that you can think of. And because of the notes being presented there for comfort of reading, we have like, some additional constraint in our dashboard or in our ecosystem of visualization. And to have consistency between this and the chronological order, as you see in the documents, this is why we have like the visual timeline there. So yes, the unconventional top to bottom timeline makes sense here because it prevents the cognitive load associated with reconciling a spatial mapping that would be in one instance, like, from top to bottom, and the other instance from left to right. So there are trade-offs again to be made. Which one is better? Where do I add some cost? Where do I gain some, benefits? So design of visual representation should not happen in isolation. We have a lot of, good guidelines. We know for a simple task, what are the best, practices in terms of best representing the data of interest. But very rarely do we consume like, one piece of information in isolation, especially in this complex, rich visual analytics, dashboard where there's a lot of crossing of data, relationships to be found. There are trade-offs to be made, because if you project the data this way, it's not going to facilitate the reasoning about the data for X or Y or the task. So there are trade-offs, and a lot of those trade-offs are dictated by how you make decisions for other visualization component. So it's not like just taking each data view or widget and apply visualization guidelines to optimize perception and interpretation within each view. The interplay between the views and the other graphical elements in the interface are to be factored in, and the interactions as well that want to support, that you want to support should be integrated. And all of these impose additional constraints or benefits that makes these decisions much less trivial. Which is okay, right? There are trade-offs. We need to accept that by optimizing something, we may compromising on something else. But, my point is that it's important to do that consciously with intent and understand the implications. We cannot put all of the, sliders at the top. By making a decision, some other will go down, but we have to be conscious about which ones and make this informed decision. So speaking about interactive dashboards, here's another one that we recently worked on in collaboration with healthcare professionals at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. Our context is to support clinicians during their daily rounds in a pediatric intensive care unit, which involves monitoring fluids in every critically ill children every day. So basically, you have a ward with a number of beds with children critically ill, and there is a team of accredited clinicians who, of whom one particular team member provides a curated summary of the patient's status orally to a team of experts. Somebody goes and studies the data, and then when the team is there to do the round in the ward, there's someone who says, oh, patient N, this is our problem. Patient X, this is our problem. And then the team decides on whether there are actions to take for the patient. So really, I want to pause here. The delivery of the information is made orally. So no need to mention that the speaking delivery is error prone, because, as somebody talks, and I'm sure, of all of the content I deliver orally, there's some, moments where you don't capture all of the information. It's very easy to make errors, to retain, information incorrectly, or to forget easily. So the point here is that many of the errors in the intensive care units are actually preventable because they are common errors that are vehicled by this mode of delivery. And so this is what we aim to address with this visualization dashboard. So, and it helps you have this interactive dashboard. I'm not going to go into details of how to operate this dashboard, but it's similar fashion. So you have a number of different indicators, and you want to see and consume this data in an interactive way. So we designed this carefully, startup dashboard to support specific analytical tasks. But when we deployed and tried to see how clinicians use this, we were really taken aback by the fact that it was not enough. Why? Because formulating patient problems from this interactive dashboard, multi-purpose dashboard, is cognitively demanding and requires expertise. So if I'm telling you, oh, can you tell me whether the fluids in are sufficient for this patient? Not all of the views that you see in this dashboard are relevant for answering this question. And when you have to do, take the mouse and then operate and then highlight things, it takes time and efforts to do that. And at the same time, if you show everything, it's also information overload. So by making it, flexible, these interactive dashboards, they are meant to be flexible in terms of you can answer many questions, but it involves interacting and creating the pieces from a rich and complete, display. And the challenge is in these words, the clinicians doesn't want any single millisecond that you can gain is important. And so if you can streamline this process, that would be a really, really strong gain. So what we learned there is that we cannot rely on an interactive dashboard and then delegate all of the work to the clinician to operate that dashboard. There's a way we can do that better. And we call that the problem-based created data views, which basically relies on the power of checklists. So we know that they have to check all of these elements for every single patient every day. Fluid overload, free creep, these are common problems in the particular patients that we're talking about here. And so we combine the power of these checklists with the power of visualization that shows the information the right way, for the right task. And so instead of having the clinician go and click on different parts of the dashboard to get this information, we have an actual system where the visualization dashboard first shows you the list of problems. The system identified automatically, oh, there might be a problem for this patient at this point. That's what you see when you enter the ward. So from a distance, you see all of the beds. If for one patient, most of the problems are labeled red, it's like the system says you should attend to this person before you attend to another patient. And as the clinician approach this, the bed, we have the computer at the bedside. They can start to interact with the interactive dashboard. So there are many different, you can notice like we have still this list of problems here on the left and the interactive pieces with the number of indicators. But as I was telling you earlier, like operating this to click in, get the details here is costly for the clinician. We want this ability for them to inquire for any question and look at specifics in the visualizations. But for most of the common problems, we want to save this time because we know exactly which view is relevant for which problem. And as such, we have this mechanism. So using the same checklist that you saw earlier, what the clinician can do is just basically, should come in a second, over that particular problem and then get from the dashboard the actual created view that is relevant to study this problem. And you see the values and you see the anomalies that the system has identified, which was not visible from the main dashboard to save, visual clutter. And so you have this ability to just have a shortcut, if you wish, for each of those problems. What is the best, set of elements from my more complex dashboard that I can pull up to answer this question? And there's some other mechanism to indicate when the clinical team has, identified and treated this particular problem in the mode of a checklist, which I'm happy to discuss in the discussion time after, but I will move forward with the presentation here. So the lesson to retain from this is interaction is great to support dynamic generation of the visual representation that is most appropriate to the task at hand. You put your, cursor there, you acquire the data and information that you need, but it should not be blindly relied on because there are dangers to defer all of the work to the user. Some may not be able to operate it because they're kind of lost in too much richness. But importantly, it's costing time and cognition resources whenever you have to operate that system yourself. So speaking of interaction, let me switch gears here for a moment and talk about another very important aspect where design of visual representation is critical. It is for input. So we often overlook that aspect of visual representation, but think about it this way. So these are two teapots. By just looking at them, you were able to make a very quick judgment, we're built in this way, about what the object affords in terms of what we can do with it. By just looking at it, you cannot sit on these objects. That's not what the affordance of this object is. But you know that you can grab these objects by the handle. One is on top, one is on the side. You can take the lead and take something. You know that you can, move the thing around and maybe something will pour out of the nozzle of these teapots. So we call that affordances in HCI. That's, a concept that is very much, well understood and that has been used extensively in user interfaces. So the shape and form of objects indicate to us what we can do with these objects. And think about a traditional user interface. If a button is flat and looks like, an image pasted there, it doesn't work. You don't really know it's a button. But the moment we put some shading on it, then you say, oh, that's something that is in relief and I can press on it. So there's a lot of visual cues that we gain from seeing objects that help you, understand what are the affordances, what are the interaction we can have with this particular object. And so these cues have been extensively studied, of course, and borrowed for the design of graphical interfaces. It's important to think about how the right visual representation will help you suggest the right interaction. We can go much further than the buttons. And instead of having these buttons and menus, we can leverage also the power of visual representation and their affordances by refining abstract content, by making abstract concepts visible to you and enable interaction on them. So let me explain what I mean with this example here. So we have an artist drawing on a tablet. And so what's interesting here is when the artist figures out that the ear he drew does not have quite the right shape for the cat. And there he pulls up an underlying mesh that it can directly manipulate. You can see like it changes the aspect of the grid by grabbing these handles. And as a result, the strokes, the drawing on top of this, like, distorting mesh are being adjusted as a result of the interaction. So this is what we call reification, right? So we reify the concept of a stretchable canvas in this instance, and we make it visible through the means of this grid, and we make it interactable. So we use it for input. So when you grab this handle and you stretch, it's like having drawn in like a t-shirt, and then you stretch the t-shirt, right? So that's really making this concept visible and interactable. And designing the proper visual representation for this is not always straightforward, but it's super, super powerful. So visual representation as manipulable reifications of concepts to be interacted with. Visual representations are powerful when they act as manipulable reifications. So you have a concept, you make it visible, and you make it directly manipulable. This was an example of shape preserving distortion of a drawing through a sketchable canvas. But let me show you another example here, which I find pretty fun. Here's like we had this reification of for input going beyond spatial canvas. So here we had the crazy idea of simultaneously painting in space and time, powered by motion flow. So for example, you have a video and you want, like, to paint over top of that video. And so that's what we propose with this particular tool that we call direct paint. So here you can draw in space on a typical canvas, and then you can propagate this paint over time by using the information that we know from the video. So this is all achieved within the same interaction. Let me show you that more slowly. So at the beginning, you apply paint on the canvas. That's spatial painting. And then as you trigger with pressure, you see this path appearing. And this path is a calculation of where the pixel from my video travels over time. And within this interaction, instead of, like, using a traditional timeline and moving over time, you just follow this path. You say, oh, my paint should go all the way to, like, minute blah, following that trajectory. And that applies to the whole stroke that you drew within the same, interaction. And you can do that with different, portion of your video. So that was the original video. And that's what I could produce in less than 5 minutes using direct paint. So granted, this might not be pretty. I'm not an artist. I'm not pretending to be. And there's limitations also with the tracking of the pixels, the visual flow, and so on. But the point mostly with this project is, like, the interaction. So we reify the space-time, trajectory of those pixels to support the design goal of painting in space through time. Another example where we reify space and time, perhaps more traditionally this time, this is a use case of personal planning. So within the day, there are many things that we're doing that involve different locations and different times, right? So recognizing that our lives are very much planned in both space and time, in this project, we thought to bridge the gap between route mapping and time scheduling tools to support a general purpose spatial temporal planning workflow. So one visual representation is great for spatial reasoning, one is great for temporal reasoning, but when we organize ourselves, we think about both at the same time. How long would I take to travel there? Does it fit within my schedule, and so on? But most of the current visual representation, they have those two separated. I said, let's integrate the two. So basically, we merge two traditional reifications of space and time to work in synchronicity, right? But most interestingly, we augment these also with the notion of choice. So here you see we have the calendar synchronized with the map, but as you see this motion, this sliding motion, that is a concept of, oh, what are my alternatives, stories that I can do like for the rest of my day. So the swipe motion that we see is basically interacting with this carousel of choices of this particular, block of time in the schedule to compare all of my different options. So we have actually a novel mechanism to support the specification of these choices. Say you want to go for lunch, you have several options. You're not going to go to all of the restaurants. So this block, semantic block, should be pick one of n options and make it fit in my schedule, spatially and temporally. And so that semantic block is, I can go get noodles, I can go get dumplings, or I can go to the Indians. So, but the system should help you, see those different stories, and the choice will be one out of many. And the other semantic block that you can have would be, I have multiple errands to run, I have 2 hours ahead of me. Try to fit as many as possible. And there's another way of combining space-time within the same, kind of system and allowing you to see these different stories and alternatives here. So visual representations as manipulable reification of concepts to be interacted with was another example. But what's interesting here is that these reifications are part of the system. That is, they have been designed by the system designers. We design this map and calendar and the integration and so on, but the visual representation don't necessarily have to be designed in advance. The user can actually draw these reifications too, and that's my last example before I conclude. So for instance, you want to create an animation, and that's what we talked about. That's the product that made it a sketchbook motion. So you want to create an animation, and so the system, initially called Draco, you can draw the intended spatial temporal behavior of, somebody like blowing through this little thing to make soap bubbles, right? So if you think about animation, traditional animation, tools, they will require you to either code or specify physics in animation, specification tools. But if I describe to you this behavior, I can use gestures and draw things that would be super explicit to you, and you would understand my intent. So for example, you can start drawing your soap bubbles here, and then you can indicate the system, I want them to follow this trajectory, and then poof, it knows. And they can deviate, and there, by just sketching, you create like an actual vector of motion. Each of my bubbles should move locally, and you showed that by example. And here what we see at the bottom is basically a temporal behavior, which is a size and a speed. And then instead of setting parameters, keyframes, and so on, you say generally the size will be small at the beginning and increase in values. And the speed will do the opposite trend. So this is what we can sketch directly through a visual representation. It's just a basic data visualization here along analysis. So you note that we can create animation without, by creating our own visual representation without having to go to menus and so on and so forth. So it's direct manipulation. I draw a visual representation of what I mean, and then the system can interpret that and infer what I meant. So user authored visual representations can be used as input, and that's a very powerful concept and far from trivial one to implement, because you need to be able to interpret what a particular stroke means. So with that, I'm conscious of time. I had a little bit more that I could cover, but visual representations, hopefully I've effectively conveyed that they are very powerful. They are difficult to design. It's easy to misuse them. It's easy to, make a misstep and have the counter effect. But when you have identified the proper concept or idea to represent, then there are a ton of opportunities to design an interesting and meaningful reification of these concepts, be it for communication, to support input, or to externalize cognition or more, right? And so people, we can use a visual representation as input, output, and input-output, I like to say. So really, we should leverage their power a little bit more in our interfaces, but it's not trivial. And as a concluding thought, like there are people who like to use the metaphor of a hammer, you know, to qualify visualization and visual representation. Yes, they are super powerful tool that when designed and used well can do great things, but when misused also or underused can do great damage, right? And I do believe that this hammer is too weak of a metaphor. In fact, I think visual representation is one of our most powerful tools, actually. We've seen too many like, political action that went in one way or another just by the power of showing like, misrepresenting information and so on, or, human mistakes by like, poor design of things. And so I think like, the hammer is more like the god of all hammers with great powers, and that one requires to use wisely. So I close on this thought. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to have a discussion.